The pie was still warm when I carried it out the front door. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't rehearsed what I would say or mapped out some dramatic exit the way people do in movies. I simply heard the words, felt something shift quietly inside my chest, picked up the pie dish with both hands, and walked out. The cold November air hit my face, and I just kept moving toward my car, the crust golden and fragrant, the filling still bubbling faintly underneath the foil. Nobody stopped me. That part, I think, said everything. I should start a little further back. Not too far, just far enough for you to understand how I ended up carrying a pie across my son's driveway on Thanksgiving afternoon at 67 years old, with nowhere particular to go. My husband passed 6 years ago, quietly the way he did most things. A Tuesday morning in March, still in his favorite chair by the window, coffee going cold on the side table. We had been married 41 years. I won't spend too long here because this story isn't really about grief. It's about what came after grief, when I wasn't paying close enough attention. After he was gone, I rattled around our house for 2 years. 3 bedrooms, a yard I couldn't keep up with alone, a furnace that made a sound like someone clearing their throat every November. I was fine. I want to be clear about that. I was managing. I had my garden, my neighbor Carol, my Tuesday morning library shift. I was not a woman falling apart. But my son called one evening, and he sounded different. Tight around the voice in a way that reminded me of when he was 16 and had broken something he didn't want to tell me about. I asked him directly what was wrong. He took a long breath and told me that he and my daughter-in-law were underwater. Not slightly behind, genuinely, seriously underwater. Medical bills from my daughter-in-law's surgery the year before, a business investment that had gone wrong, credit card debt stacked on top of both. He wasn't asking me for money outright. He said he just wanted me to know. I sold my house 4 months later. I want you to understand that I made this decision with clear eyes. Nobody twisted my arm. I knew what I was doing. The house sold for enough to clear their debt entirely, with a reasonable amount left over that I set aside for myself. In return, I moved into their spare bedroom. My son said it would be good for everyone. I wouldn't be alone. They'd have help with the grandchildren. We'd save money across the board. It sounded on paper like one of those arrangements where everyone wins. It took approximately 6 weeks for me to understand that I was the only one who hadn't read the fine print. It didn't happen all at once. That's what I want you to know about this kind of thing. It never does. It happens in layers, so slowly that you keep asking yourself if you're imagining it. A comment about how I'd loaded the dishwasher wrong. A sigh when I asked what time dinner was. My daughter-in-law mentioning in passing to someone on the phone that the situation at home was a lot to manage. I was the situation. I understood that. I stopped eating breakfast with them because the kitchen felt like a place I was tolerated in rather than welcomed. I started timing my showers for when my daughter-in-law was out of the house. I kept my door closed. I learned the architecture of the space I was allowed to occupy, and I stayed inside it. My granddaughter was 22 and still living at home while she finished her last year of school. She was the one bright thing in those months. She knocked on my door in the evenings sometimes, sat on the edge of my bed and just talked to me about her classes, her friends, a boy she wasn't sure about. She brought me tea without being asked. She was the only person in that house who looked at me like I was a person rather than an inconvenience someone had donated furniture to. One evening, she sat quietly for a moment after we'd been talking, then said, "Grandma, are you okay? Like, actually okay?" I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way young people look at you when they're too kind to call you a liar. The months moved on. I tried harder. I cooked when I could, contributed to the grocery bill, babysat when my son and daughter-in-law went out. I stayed out of the way. I told myself that adjustment takes time, that blended living arrangements are always complicated, that I was not a guest but a family member, and family members push through difficult patches. Then October came, and my daughter-in-law mentioned Thanksgiving. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things that involved me, not to me, but near me. She was on the phone with her sister at the kitchen table, and I was coming down the hall, and I heard her say they were expecting 14 people this year, and that the house was going to be packed. I paused in the doorway and she looked up and said, without warmth, but without hostility either, the way you'd tell a coworker, the printer was out of paper. We're going to need your room for coats. Just so you know, my room for coats. I said, of course, and went back down the hall. I started baking the week before Thanksgiving. This was not unusual. I have been baking for holidays since I was 19 years old and watched my own mother turn a kitchen into something warm and enormous. I make a brown sugar sweet potato pie that my husband used to say could end arguments. My mother taught me, and her mother taught her, and the recipe exists nowhere written down because it lives in my hands. I made 2 of them that Wednesday evening, the kitchen smelling like cinnamon and butter, and I felt, for the first time in months, like myself. My daughter-in-law came in around 9 o'clock, looked at the pies cooling on the rack and said, "Oh, I already ordered dessert from the bakery. We have 3 pies coming tomorrow." She said it pleasantly enough. She wasn't cruel about it. She turned and went upstairs without asking if I'd like her to cancel the order, without suggesting we could have both, without acknowledging that I had spent 2 hours in a kitchen making something from memory and love. She just said it and left. I covered my pies with foil and went to bed. Thanksgiving morning was loud and organized in the way my daughter-in-law liked things controlled, scheduled, efficient. She had assigned dishes to different guests, coordinated arrival times, arranged flowers on the table herself. I offered to help and was handed a task setting out the appetizer plates, the kind of task you give someone when you want them to feel included but out of the way. By 2 o'clock, 14 people filled the dining room and living room. The table was set beautifully. My son was pouring wine. The grandchildren were chasing each other somewhere upstairs. It was, from a distance, the kind of Thanksgiving that looks right in photographs. My daughter-in-law came through the kitchen and said, almost brightly, "Oh, Margaret, she always used my name like that, as if she'd just remembered it. There's really no room at the main table. We've got all 14 and it's a little tight. There's space at the folding table in the corner with the kids." I was 67 years old. I had sold my house. I had spent 2 hours making pie. She was already turning back toward her guests. And something in me, something I didn't know was still there, something that had been very quiet for a very long time, simply said, "No," not out loud, not yet. I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice or say something I'd regret in front of 14 people who barely knew me. I walked to the counter, lifted the foil off one of my pies, picked up the dish with both hands, found my coat on the hook in the hall where it had not been replaced by anyone's coat yet, and walked out the front door. I heard my granddaughter say, "Grandma?" from somewhere behind me. I kept walking. My car was at the curb. I put the pie on the passenger seat. I sat for a moment with both hands in my lap. The street was quiet the way streets get on holidays, everyone inside, all the living happening behind other people's windows. I was not crying. I want to be clear about that. I was something steadier than crying. I was decided. I drove to Carol's house. Carol opened the door in an apron and took one look at my face and said, "Come in. How many plates do you need?" I stayed for 4 hours. We ate pie at her kitchen table, just the 2 of us, and talked about everything and nothing. And at one point I laughed so hard at something she said that I knocked over my water glass, and she laughed too, and we cleaned it up together. It was one of the best Thanksgivings I'd had in years. When I drove back that evening, the guests were gone. The house was quiet in the particular way that follows loud gatherings, a little deflated. Every surface slightly sticky. My son was in the living room. He looked at me when I came in with the expression of a man who knew something had happened and had spent 4 hours deciding how much it was his problem. He said, "Mom, she didn't mean anything by it." I said, "I know." He said, "It's just logistics. You know how big these things get." I said, "I know." He waited for something more, and I didn't give it to him. I went to bed, and I lay in the dark, not the room, with the coats. They'd put them in the front closet after all. And I thought carefully, for a long time, about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. I thought about my mother, who worked until her hands were cracked and never sat down at her own table until everyone else had been served. I thought about all the years I spent making myself smaller so the people around me would fit more comfortably. I thought about the recipe that lived in my hands and nowhere else. I thought, I am not done. The next morning, I called a rental agent. I didn't tell my son until I had already found a place. A one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes away, second floor, with a bay window in the kitchen that got morning light. It was modest. It was mine. I had enough from what I'd set aside after selling the house to cover the deposit and a year of rent without stress. I had not told them exactly how much I had set aside. This turned out to matter later. When I told my son I was moving out, he looked genuinely surprised. Not upset, not apologetic surprised, as though the thought that I might have preferences about where I lived had not occurred to him as a real possibility. He said, "Are you sure that's practical?" I said, "I've been practical my whole life. I'm going to try something else." My daughter-in-law said very little. She nodded and said she hoped I'd be comfortable, in the tone of voice you use for people you've already stopped thinking about. My granddaughter cried, which surprised me. She sat on the bed while I packed and said, "I'm sorry, Grandma. I should have said something. I saw what was happening, and I should have said something." I stopped folding and looked at her. "This is not yours to apologize for. I still should have." I sat next to her. "You knocked on my door in the evenings. You brought me tea. You looked me in the eye." I put my hand over hers. "You did more than you know." She helped me move. She spent the whole Saturday carrying boxes, assembling my bed frame, figuring out where my kitchen things should go. She hung a small print on the wall above the bay window, a watercolor of a garden, and stood back and said, "There, now, it looks like you." I made dinner that night for the two of us. Brown sugar, sweet potato pie for dessert. She took one bite and closed her eyes and said, "Grandma, you have to write this down." I laughed. "It's in here," I said, touching my temple, "where it belongs." The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected, and I say that as a person who had been craving quiet for the better part of a year. But this was a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of making yourself small, but the quiet of space that belongs to you. I could eat breakfast at whatever time I pleased. I could leave my coat on the hook without wondering if someone needed the hook more. I could bake on a Wednesday evening for no reason, and eat the results at midnight if I wanted. I joined a book club at the library, which Carol had been asking me to do for years. I started walking every morning, not for exercise exactly, just for the pleasure of having somewhere to be that I'd chosen. I found a little pottery class on Thursday afternoons that I was terrible at and loved completely. The instructor was a woman in her 50s named Diane, who told me on my first day that the goal was not to make beautiful things, but to make things, and I thought about that for a long time afterward. I was not lonely. I want you to understand that. People assume that when a woman my age lives alone, she must be lonely. But loneliness isn't about being alone. I'd been lonelier in that spare bedroom with 3 people in the house than I was now with just my own company and a bay window full of morning light. My son called occasionally. The calls were polite and slightly awkward, like talking to someone you used to know well. He asked how I was. I told him. He updated me on things at home. I listened. Neither of us went below the surface. I realized, not angry at him. Not anymore. Anger requires a certain amount of energy, and I had decided to spend mine elsewhere. My daughter-in-law didn't call. My granddaughter came by every week without fail. Sometimes she brought groceries, sometimes just herself. She sat at my kitchen table and studied while I read, each of us in our own quiet, comfortable as two people who don't need to fill silence can be. She was, I understood, the person in my family who saw me clearest. And I loved her for it, in the particular way you love someone who bothers to look. In March, 4 months after I moved out, my son called and his voice had that tightness again. The same one from years ago when he first told me about the debt. I knew before he finished the sentence that he was in trouble again. The business had taken another bad turn. Not as catastrophic as before, but significant. He was asking, more directly this time, if I had anything set aside. He mentioned that he knew the house sale had left me with some savings. He used the word help several times. He mentioned, carefully, that he had a spare room, the same spare room if I ever wanted to come back to save money. I listened to all of it. Then I said, gently, and without any edge, I can't help with this. Silence on his end. I need what I have for myself, I said. I'm going to need it for a long time. I intend to be here a long time. He said he understood, in the voice of someone who did not understand at all. I didn't feel guilty. I thought I might. And I sat with myself for several days waiting for the guilt to show up, but it didn't. What showed up instead was something quieter and more solid. Something that felt a little like the first deep breath after a long time of breathing shallow. I had spent 40 years giving and rearranging and adjusting, and somewhere along the way, I had stopped keeping anything for myself, and I was done with that. I called my lawyer on a Thursday morning in April. I had an appointment already. I'd been thinking about this for months. I sat across the desk from him, with my hands folded in my lap, and I told him I wanted to update my will. What I had set aside from the house sale, the accounts, the small pieces of jewelry from my mother's collection, I wanted to be deliberate and clear. My granddaughter was the primary beneficiary. She had loved me without condition, looked at me when others looked through me, sat on the edge of my bed and asked if I was actually okay. She had cried when I moved out, had spent a Saturday carrying boxes, had hung a watercolor garden above my bay window so the apartment would look like me. She had earned nothing and deserved everything. I left something for my son enough to know I hadn't forgotten him, because I hadn't. I didn't want revenge. I want to be honest about that. What I wanted was accuracy. I wanted the document to reflect, as honestly as I could manage, who had shown up and who hadn't. I signed the papers and thanked my lawyer and drove home in the April sunshine with the window down. That summer, I took a trip. Carol and I drove up the coast for a week. Nothing extravagant, a rented cottage, long walks, seafood, used bookstores in small towns we'd never heard of. I sent my granddaughter a photograph from a beach somewhere, 2 women in their 60s with salt in their hair, laughing at something that had just fallen out of Carol's bag. She sent back 3 heart emojis and then called me that evening just to hear more about it. I am still in my apartment. The bay window gets good light in the morning, better than I expected. I grow herbs on the sill: basil, rosemary, a small mint plant that has gotten completely out of hand. I have baked the sweet potato pie so many times this year that my neighbor 2 doors down now appears at my door around the holidays with a look of quiet hope. And I always have an extra. My granddaughter finished school. She is starting a job she's excited about, which is enough. She comes by Sundays when she can, and we cook together sometimes, and I have been slowly, deliberately teaching her things. The pie, a few other recipes, the way my mother showed me without writing anything down. I think about that Thanksgiving afternoon sometimes. The cold air, the pie, warm in my hands, walking toward my car with no particular plan. People ask, occasionally, if I regret it. If I wish I had handled it differently, stayed and made my case, tried harder to work things out. I don't. Here is what I know. I spent a long time taking up just enough space to be useful without being inconvenient. I kept myself quiet and compact and undemanding. I called it being easy to live with. I called it family. But there is a difference between being part of something and being accommodated by it, and I spent too long not knowing the difference. Walking out was not a moment of anger. It was a moment of clarity. It was picking up the one thing I had made with my own hands and walking toward a place where it would be appreciated. That is not drama. That is just a woman understanding, finally, what she's worth. And what she's worth is a seat at the table. Any table, her own if necessary. Mine is in front of a bay window that gets good light, with a mint plant that is completely out of hand, and that is more than enough. It is, in fact, everything.